All right, everyone, here we go with Chapter 13, News Production. It isn't always possible to change the content of a news story every hour, every half hour, but it is possible to change the production or the editing structure of a story. And that helps to try to create this presence of the idea that news is fresh, especially in an environment where you are doing hourly news reports. The hectic pace of news requires that you be able to do the work quickly. But not just quickly, you also have to do the work well. So the news environment, when you're creating content, you really have to be on your game. You have to know your editing software really well. You have to know your content really well so that you can get in, record, edit, and get it out there in a really, really quick turnaround sort of situation. Oh, and it also helps that you make sure that the news is correct. The goal of radio news programming is to offer something more than an announcer reading the copy. If all it is a newsreader, it doesn't make things very interesting. So using different sound elements to add to the variety and maximize the impact of the story can be very helpful. Radio is unsurpassed for timeliness and portability. That is, getting the story on the air quickly, anytime, and anywhere, especially with the tools that we have available to us now, where it could be just as easy to record a story on your cell phone or other portable broadcast equipment, and with the connectivity of the internet, simply saving a file, creating that MP3 and sending it off through email or through an FTP server or something like that. We can be immediate with getting the details of a story out there. So let's talk about news gathering. News gathering consists of obtaining facts from which stories are written, going out, getting the information, making sure that information is correct, and putting those facts and details into words, which we then record and get out on the airways. It consists of collecting actualities, the recorded segments of news events or newsmakers. So when you're out and about covering a story, all the different sounds, the different interviews, all those sort of things, we call those actualities. An actuality can be an interview segment. It could be a recording of the wild sound resulting from an event. The traffic that's going on behind you, or the sound of the fire engine coming to the scene of a fire, those sorts of things. Wild sound or an interview actuality is often referred to as a sound bite. So those little audio elements in addition to reporting the story that add a bit of flavor to a story. Those are sound bites. News gathering for radio also involves a great deal of recording from the telephone. So when you're in the studio, you can't get to the county courthouse or whatever the scene may be. Perhaps getting an interview with an official that you can record their voice over the phone, that is also a way of getting actualities. Using newspapers or news websites, you want to be very careful here when you do this. You want to check multiple sources, and you want to make sure to rewrite material that you find from the primary sources. And when we talk about rewriting, you want to make sure that you get the information correct, but you also want to make sure that you're not just copying a story from the newspaper word from word, or copying verbatim things that you find on an internet article. There's copyright issues there. So you have to be very careful to make sure that the information that you get, you make it in such a way that it becomes your own content. It's important for a radio news staff to develop its own system of news gathering, whether it's calling on various sources for information, making calls to the police, those sorts of things, because listeners generally are not tolerant of old news. Especially when it comes to radio, we really talk about the idea that radio has that sense of immediacy, that we can bring you things as it's happening, that you're in the element, that you're in the moment. So if you're talking about things that happened several days ago and it's stuff that people already have a sense about, then radio loses its relevancy and its strength, because those sort of things you can easily just pick up a newspaper or go onto a website article and find out that information. All right, news writing. Words, their order, their meaning, their rhythm, they can be considered to be a production value. The style of writing influences the sound, and writing does, of course, put the whole package together. So you want to think about, when you're crafting a story, that you're not just getting the facts out there, but you want to, as we've talked about in previous chapters, choose wording in such a way that it's going to be easy for the listener to follow and to be able to get that information, that it's written in such a way that it's going to be interesting to hear, short, simple sentences, active words, all those sorts of things. So you want to be mindful of that when you're putting pen to paper in writing a story that's to be meant to be read over the airwaves. Writing also involves the way sound elements are assembled. Thinking about where you include the natural sound from the scene of a news story, the placement of where you're going to have an interviewee talk within a story. Those things are important for syntax, for flow, all those sorts of things. Remember that what is written must sound right when it's read aloud. It must be conversational as well, so clarity is going to be critical when you're putting together a news story. Newspapers use the inverse pyramid writing style. What that means is that the important who, what, when, where, and why, it's all listed in the first few sentences. In newspapers, they call that the lead. Kind of a sense that gives you the summary of everything that's happening, or the important parts of what's happening in the story, in that first sentence or in that first paragraph. Now, if you try to write that way for radio, it's going to be confusing and boring for a listener, because you try to push all that information out in that first sentence or two, and then everything else winds up just being fluff or inconsequential. Radio news demands shorter sentences and active verb tenses. So you want to give general information first, then fill in the details. So what that does, when you give the general information first, kind of an overarching main idea as opposed to a detailed main idea or a lead line, then what that does is that creates in the sense of the listener, ooh, that's interesting, tell me more. And then that's where you get the opportunity to give them the who, what, when, where, why, and how. When attribution needs to be given, it's usually better to put it early in the story. Cite your sources and do it on the front end, because it lends credibility to what you are reporting on. Let's talk about putting the news together. When you're choosing stories, the order of those stories, when you run a story first, you're in essence making it the lead story. So when you make a story the first story, the lead story, you're putting out there that this is the most important thing that is happening at this particular moment. So it's kind of putting your strong suit out there first. So think about it that way when you're taking on a bunch of stories. What's going to be the most relevant to the listener? Or what's going to be the most important thing that they need to hear? Make that story number one. The radio news producer must be aware that it is often necessary to shuffle news stories from hour to hour. That provides variety in the news, especially if it's a slow news day. And the fact that sometimes people tune in, people tune out, so it's important to try to cover things in such a way that you're getting all the stories out there. Now, it's still important to have a strong lead, but maybe there's several stories that can work well as being the first story, or that you present that story in different ways. You want to do those things to the extent that you're keeping the integrity of the news, but that you're also providing a little bit of difference from hour to hour in terms of what the listener hears to keep the listener interested and engaged. A story is often pushed up in the rotation simply because it's new. The time element is an important consideration because radio is a medium that thrives on timeliness, the immediacy of radio. Radio can provide news more quickly than any other medium. So many times, not always, but many times, it is really good to start off, make your lead story the thing that has just happened or is the freshest story that you have available. Because, again, it kind of creates that sense in the listener of, oh, this is happening right now, and it plays to the strength of radio. Choosing sound elements, a couple of things here to keep in mind. Voice reports, these are straight news items that are reported by a journalist. So when you have an anchor tossing to a reporter to tell a story, if it's just a reporter relaying the details, that's a voice report. A voicer is a short report delivered by a reporter in the field, generally recorded in one take. Kind of has that sense of being live and giving you just the quick details of something that is going on. A voice actuality is a report from a journalist with an actuality segment inserted. So you have the voicer plus the other sound that comes along with it, somebody that he or she interviewed, or the ambient sound of what's going on in a scene. Now, let's talk about radio news writing, some things to keep in mind when you are actually crafting the content of the story. Broadcast copy makes a path from eye to mouth to ear. So it must be different in style, in punctuation, and sentence structure than how you would write a term paper or a newspaper report. You want to keep that in mind. All the things that we talked about in Chapter 11 with writing for the ear, you want to keep those things in mind when you are writing news for radio. You're not exactly writing, though, so it's kind of a misnomer. In a way, what you're really doing is you're committing speech to paper. So you're trying to write in the way that you would speak. You're telling a story. The story is going to be spoken. So you have to use words and phrases that are going to be able to be spoken naturally. And you must relay the story in the form that we're used to hearing people use when they tell a story. When you think about it this way, you put the words on the page. You pick up the page and you start reading out loud. Can you make what you're reading out loud sound conversational, like you were telling somebody in the room the things that are going on? If you can do that, then you're writing successfully for radio news. Some script conventions to keep in mind when you're talking about paper and print. Some people still use pen and paper and, printing out things from the computer, making hard copies. Not to mention the fact that, say you're doing storm coverage or something, and, you're typing your stuff on the computer, you go to print it out, and then before the newscast goes on, you lose power or your computer crashes. It's really good to have that paper hard copy backup so you don't have to fumble when it comes to reporting the news because you can't get to the stuff you just wrote. You want to make sure words are easily readable. So think about this whether you're looking at an actual hard copy or if you're looking at content on a computer screen. You want to make sure that there's a lot of white space. Using wide margins, double or triple spacing your copy. And you want to, especially if you're looking at pen and paper, try to avoid as few corrections as possible, marking it up with a pen or that sort of thing. If you do have to make a correction, make sure it is clear and clean so that it's very easy to read. It's also really good to use a large, clear typeface, and that makes it, again, pop out on the page. It makes it easy to look at and read as you are on the air. Now, an old standard That's no longer really a universal standard. Some people still do it. They like to type out their copy using all caps. It's becoming less and less of a thing, but some people find reading all capital letters easier when they are looking at a script and putting it on the air. That's really going to be a personal preference. Some stations make use of news software programs or web-based wire services to assist in finding stories and writing or rewriting news copy. There's various different programs out there that kind of serve as a central database for news stories that a station has gathered, perhaps as an aggregate for different wire services that the company is subscribed to, and you can pull up stories. You can take stories from one wire service or from one reporter that they did earlier in the day, and you can aggregate those and create your own newscast and move stories around and that sort of thing. The header. Most broadcast news departments require writers to put some basic information right at the top of the page. This is called the slug. The slug is a very brief description, usually just a key word that identifies the story. It's also going to have the writer's name or initials and the date of the story. So that makes it really easy reference to figure out what the story is about, how old the story is. Sometimes in addition to the date, they will also have the time written up in the slug, especially if it's a story that's developing and changing on an hourly basis. So those are the sorts of things that you're going to find on a slug. Okay, let's talk about tape cues now, and these are things that you're going to find within the text of a story that's going to help the anchor know what's going on with a actuality. There's going to be three things that you're going to find typically with tape cues within a story. First off, you're going to find the title of the sound file, and you're also going to learn at what point in the story the file should run. So usually you'll find, say there's an opening text to introduce the tape, the audio that's going to be going out. And then you'll find this tape cue, and you'll have the title of the tape cue, the title of the audio rather, that you're going to pull up. You're going to find the length of the sound file so that you know how long the audio piece is, and you're going to find the out cue. This is usually going to be the last couple, 3, 4 words of that sound bite, or if there's like some sort of sound effect or something at the end and that sort of thing. So generally you're going to find those items within a tape cue that is located within the text of a story. Some stations will also list the in cue of the actuality, which is the first few words or sounds on a file, and that helps to verify that you are running the correct audio within a newscast. Some stations will write out the text of the actuality in the report to serve as a backup in case the actuality can't be played. And there have been many times that audio has failed within a newscast, and it is helpful to have that text, or at least have a basic idea of the content of that audio in case the anchor does have to hop in and kind of fill in the gap. Story tags. It's generally considered poor form to simply end with an actuality and go on to the next story. Doing that confuses listeners and makes the story seem oddly incomplete. So kind of think of it in terms of a donut. The anchor's going to have some beginning intro audio, then you're going to have the actuality, and then the anchor comes back on to close out the story. When you're looking at news copy, generally you'll see 3 pound signs at the end of that news story, and that indicates that the story is ended. Simple enough there. Most radio stations will not run longer than 1 page of text when it comes to a news story, but if they have to, there's going to usually be something at the bottom of that page to indicate that there is more content. And that's going to be designated either with an arrow or the word more or something like that. Now, this is important. If you must split a story into 2 pages, you want to make sure you never break a sentence. You don't want to have like half a paragraph on page 1 and then the other half of the paragraph on page 2. You always want to end a page with a complete sentence. That way, if for some reason page 2 gets lost, then there's at least a chance at the story being coherent just as it has been presented. Making a second reference to the speaker after the actuality will help clarify the story in the listener's mind. Keep in mind, we only have our ears to be able to digest what is being put out over the airwaves. So as much as you're able to lead the audience member along in how you're telling the story, the situation that's going on, who is doing what, all those sorts of things, the more that you can do to help keep your listener informed exactly what all's going on, the better it's going to be. A lead into a voice report, when you put these together, you're going to write that scripted intro. The intro may be a simple handoff to the piece, but usually there's going to be something to update the story, make it more current by reporting on the status of protected items in the recorded piece. Because many times when you have an actuality, it may not be a full-blown report. It may be kind of capturing something that's happening within the middle of the event. So when you're writing the intro should allude to what we're expected to hear, or kind of the circumstances around the particular piece of audio, whether it's a testimonial or an interview, the sound of what's happening at the scene, whatever the case may be. So the anchor's job here is to make sure that he or she is setting the scene for what the listener is about to hear with the actuality. Some notes about intros to voice reports. Be mindful of any timeliness issues. So many times you want to do your best in copy to avoid wording like last night or this afternoon within the script itself, especially if there's a chance that a story may be carried over into a different day part or even into the next day. The more that you can do to make the copy be timeless, even though we're talking about news that is timely, make sure that things in terms of time and space are going to be very clear. Don't state information in your intro that is the first sentence of the voice report. In other words, say that you have an actuality of somebody talking about their reaction to a fire that's happening downtown. And you don't want the anchor to say, John Small was distracted by what was happening in his neighborhood and got really upset. And then you go to the audio piece of John Small and he says, I got distracted by what was going on downtown and got really upset. What's the point? You want to have the introduction kind of flow nicely into the audio soundbite that the listener is about to hear. Do make a declarative statement about the news event as a lead. Make a strong opener that talks about what exactly is going on, or at least give an important facet about what the listener is about to hear generally, as the actuality is going to provide more of the detail, so that there's that sort of flow of thought. Some newsrooms will also include a brief summary of the story. So again, this would be helpful if an actuality for one reason or another is not available, or perhaps if you're in an environment where you have to keep your newscast to a certain time or something like that. If the anchor finds out that he or she is running out of time for the newscast, he or she might be able to read that brief summary as opposed to going into the full-blown report. As far as punctuation goes, some ways to indicate where a pause should be used in news copy. Different news stations are going to have different standards. You might find points of ellipse, you might find a couple of dashes, perhaps an incomplete sentence. In those sorts of ways, know what the standards are at your particular station. Commas and apostrophes are used in generally the same way as they are in any other writing. So, talking about possessives or contractions, things like that. This is where, spelling and grammar and syntax is really going to help understanding those things. If you can't comfortably read a word out loud, or if the word sounds unnatural when it's spoken, don't use it in your news copy. Don't write it on paper. Find another way to describe what is going on. As far as jargon and technical words, you only want to use words and acronyms that the audience are going to understand. For example, DOT is a popular acronym for Department of Transportation. But if it's going to be unclear to the listener what DOT means within the context of the story, go ahead and say Department of Transportation. Or you can introduce it, then use the acronym, Department of Transportation or DOT. So keep that in mind. If you don't know what the abbreviation stands for, more than likely your listener's not going to know either. But even that's not a clear assumption. Just because you know something doesn't mean your audience is going to know that. So keep that in mind. Active versus passive voice. Broadcast news writing is usually more effective, direct, and understandable when it's in the active voice rather than the passive voice. And we talked about this idea in a previous chapter, the sense that you want to make things sound like they are in the moment, that there is stuff that is happening as the listener is hearing it. You don't want to mislead the listener, but there's certain liberties that you can take in terms of helping to create that in the moment sense of a story, even if it's something that may have happened a little earlier in the day or something like that. A sentence is in the active voice when the subject performs the action. It's going to be in the passive voice when the subject of the sentence is acted on by the object, using a word such as by. When you took English classes, those would be known as inverted sentences. You can use those kinds of sentences occasionally to add a little bit of variety, or if you can do it and get away with it in such a way that it builds a kind of a sense of suspense, or it's going to be a sentence that's easy to follow in that way. But generally, you're going to go with subject, action, object. It's going to be the best formula for sentence structure in radio. Now, use of the word says. Use says under most circumstances, but if you're quoting a controversial statement or a statement pegged to a particular time, use the word said. The word claims may be used if it's in association with an unproven statement, or if there is an air of suspicion about the legitimacy of the statement. So use the word says if you can truly verify that somebody did indeed say something. Otherwise, use the word claims. And again, unless there is an issue at which it can be misleading or inappropriate to say that somebody is saying something and that is their current point of view and that is their current position, in those cases, you can use said to talk about past tense. But again, we try to keep things in the present, so says, whenever appropriate, is the proper choice for radio news. Now, in terms of numbers, usually you can simply round off large numbers, but you don't want to round off specific statements of important facts when the number really makes a difference. So think about it this way. If it's appropriate to think about things in terms of around numbers or numbers that are estimates, then rounding off numbers is going to be okay to do. And it's going to be more accepted to do because it's easier to think about 1,000 people as opposed to 994 people, unless that detail is extremely important. Spell out numbers from 1 to 10, and then use numerals after that. When we're talking about ordinal numbers, first, second, third, that sort of thing, you want to use numerals after 11, and then use the numerical number, the actual digits, when indicating ages. So if you're talking about a 4-year-old, you would actually use the digit 4 in talking about the 4-year-old when you're writing it down for news copy. Symbols and abbreviations. Symbols and abbreviations like the ones that you see on your screen are usually going to be distracting in copy that's meant to be read aloud. You want to write out the word instead. So if you're talking about $500, instead of $500, you would actually write out 5-100-dollars so that you can read those words as you are reading that copy out loud. Spell out everything unless an abbreviation is universally known by everybody. So this is that sort of sense that, think about ST, for example. ST can mean street. ST can mean saint. If there's ambiguity there, actually write out the word street or write out the word saint. Or any other abbreviations that might not be, expected when you're reading news copy. You want to write those words out and don't use the abbreviation. Middle names are generally not used when reporting on people unless it helps to avoid confusion. Now, I will say that I am finding that more news outlets are including middle names in terms of, trying to watch their backs in terms of legal circumstances. So you can kind of go either way on that one. But when you're identifying people, make sure that you are truly identifying the right person and that there is not ambiguity in terms of who you might be talking about, especially if the name tends to be kind of a popular name. There's a lot of John Smiths out there, for example. So it may be appropriate to include a middle name or, if it's the second or the third or something like that. That's going to do it for the first half of the notes. We're going to pick up and finish up the chapter over in the next video.